So in terms of Harris, in terms of divining Harris's position, how does one? What would it look like for her to do something that would be interpreted as different? Like,
well,
I mean,
that's a good question. That's the question people are asking, and I think that when Representative Rashida Tlaib says things like, I'm withholding my endorsement from Harris until I hear her position on Gaza, and groups like Uncommitted, and of course a dozen Palestinian groups, there are ways in which Harris can back channel these groups in those with credibility, both in politics and activist organizations, and signal that she genuinely is going to do the normal playbook, which is use America's dispositive leverage over Israel to impose a ceasefire. There's ways that she can do that without openly contradicting her boss. And again, there's always these kind of process reasons. I wrote an article once called there's always a reason nothing can change and nothing you do matters. There's always these kind of like instant sort of Mick arguments for why the government's always either impotent or trying their hardest and fumbling the ball. There's always an excuse why no one can sort of oppose the fact of genocide in Gaza. And I think that there are plenty of ways in which Harris can work around those constraints to signal to these groups with credibility that she is actually serious about actually imposing a ceasefire. The one kicker card is, and when you talked about the Biden White House hoping inertia would set in for the temporary pause, there's been divisions within the U.S. government about this issue. And if one uses David Ignatius at the Washington Post as a kind of weather vane of where the CIA is, it's very clear the CIA has been over this war for months now. Yeah. And the CIA is pushing for a genuine ceasefire. That's why when they call in William Burns, he's having real talks. He's not doing the Anthony Blinken thing where he goes in and he scolds Hamas and makes up some bullshit about an Israeli ceasefire. It's a genuine talk. The CIA doesn't get invited to these things unless there's actual politics to be done. They're not really there for the veneer. So to the extent to which there's a ray of hope, Harris could endorse that or could really move towards that, it would be coming from a different faction within the so-called deep state. And I think the Pentagon doesn't really care for this, doesn't really care about this. Because again, they spend all this time on their own self-mythologizing around freedom and democracy and human rights. And that's all gone to shit. That was always not very credible. But now the credibility of that has gone from 7%
right. The story about the rules-based international order, that's out the window
and they believe, and so in their mind, they're thinking, okay, Israel's made their point. The political consideration would be, if you did impose a unilateral ceasefire on Israel, would it be framed by the media as a Hamas victory? Probably just, sort of similar to like in Afghanistan. But yeah, so what? Is your short-term PR optics worth another 10,000, 20,000 dead Palestinian children? Probably not. So there are ways in which Harris can signal that there are groups and people for whom she can confide in. She has their numbers. She's one of the top 4 most powerful people in the world. She can call them whenever she wants. And the fact that she has yet to do so indicates to me that she's simply going to double down on a more sophisticated version of what the Biden White House has done, which is what I call a combination of fake ceasefire talks and highly sophisticated empathy speak. This kind of I see you, I hear you bullshit that matters to precisely Dick.
I don't want to be I don't mean to be Pollyannish about this, but if the choices as a political matter, right? Because we can agree that Harris right now, and I am certainly not defending Harris in this instance. I want to make this absolutely clear. But but the point is to analyze this from Harris's perspective. If we can agree that Harris has no real capacity to influence this decision at this juncture, it seems to me the best that could happen is that she indicates a seriousness about this that makes Netanyahu feel like, okay, if she wins in November, I've got a problem starting in January. That to me seems to be the only, is there a different way in which she could influence this? I'm saying not represent what her position would be, but I'm saying actually influence this. Because in that instance, if what I've just suggested is the case, it may not be. then anything that she does in terms of indicating to these groups, to back channels, whatever it is strictly electoral anyways.
Yeah, but no, the politicians are actually pretty honest about these things, especially in this context, because again, if that were the case, then she would have done that already. I think they, again, if she just wanted to get the uncommitted, lefties off her back, she would make these promises to these
well
groups.
I mean, but I think there's probably a calculation, I don't know if it's right or wrong, I suspect that it's wrong, that her making a significant difference, I mean, in a shift from Biden, it comes with some political price as well. I mean, because
so what? I mean, there's always again.
I agree,
liberal apologists can always game out some meta discussion, electoral reason. We could do this all day, right?
I'm trying to make an assessment as to what she can do at this point. This is not a justification for her, but this is part of the analysis.
You're playing devil's advocate a little bit. I get that.
Yeah, but if her actual ability to materially change the situation is limited, except for the notion of Netanyahu feeling like if she wins the election, I'm in trouble. Then after that, it just becomes for her a political calculation as to what is the value of appeasing the lefties, as it were. I mean, I just for the sake of ease, or sort of like indicating a bigger shift from Biden's policy beyond the fact that she didn't go to his talk.
So the issue of whether or not, there was a CNN memo when they were basically running a parallel, or rather a memo leaked to CNN when they were running a parallel Harris campaign after the debate before he dropped out in early July. And one of the key points on that memo was highlighted how Harris didn't have the albatross of Gaza hanging around her neck, and that this was a major thing holding Biden back, and that Harris could break from that. So, internally, everybody knows this is unpopular. Again, people like to sometimes make these arguments about, well, what about the pro-Israel vote? Again, no one's asking, Kamala Harris to tell Israel to lay down its arms and surrender, right? They're asking them to stop killing dozens of children, a day. So I think that's a bit of a kind of a false dichotomy. There is tremendous upside to looking like you're good on this issue. It is tremendously popular. It is popular with over 50%, 70% of Democrats. Again, it depends how you phrase the question, but generally it would be very popular for people to wrap this thing up. The constant stream of dead kids on people's social media is dragging down the Democratic brand just on a purely psychopathic kind of Machiavellian political dimension here. It undermines youth support. So Harris knows this. That's one of the reasons. I think it's one of the reasons there was a real tipping point to move it to Harris versus Biden. I think this thing had really sunk Biden. Obviously, I'm somewhat self-interested in saying that, but I think other analysts have agreed with that at least in part, in addition to the obvious, the sort of deteriorating age issue or cognitive decline, that this issue was absolutely destroying momentum. They had basically no volunteers.
I totally agree.
And that Harris was going to sort of be a superficial, at least pivot away from that. And I think people kind of got caught up in that, and there hasn't been really any kind of parallel substantive break from policy, which again is not to say that is not forthcoming or can't happen.
Right.
But to me, it's incumbent upon those for whom this issue is important, those for whom you would like to stop the gratuitous mass killing of children in Palestine with U.S. bombs, to demand clarity rather than vibes, to demand some kind of back channel commitment rather than more bleeding heart rhetoric about how, I see you, I feel you, claptrap. That there has to be something substantive to back up, because ultimately she's still running a campaign. She's still running for president, and effectively won a primary she never fought in. These issues were not allowed to be dealt with in a primary. We just skipped that, went straight to the coronation, and now it says, if you're going to be different, on certain issues, there needs to be some kind of signal or assurances behind, other than more sophisticated crocodile tears. And that is yet to be forthcoming.
I think the role of the demobilization and demoralization of activists and young people is completely underestimated in the pressure that was brought to Biden. Like, I think like the attempt by Sanders and the squad to sort of stay in Biden's camp was completely undermined by where he was on Gaza, and were it not for the Biden's policy, the outcome may have been different in some way. I'm not sure, but I do think that the problem that Harris is going to have is within the first week, the first couple of weeks, there's not that level of scrutiny by supporters, but she's going to have to address it over the course of the next 2 or 3 months.
Especially in light of recent escalations, which have pretty much cemented the fact that Israel is not negotiating anything in good faith. So when you execute your key counterpart in your negotiation with a Hellfire missile or whatever it was,
yep.
And then Harris says the next day, well, I support these ceasefire negotiations. This is not a credible or serious thing to say. And this is why, by the way, as the Biden White House began to co-opt this term ceasefire into this meaningless temporary pause hostage swap / sort of vibes-based rhetorical cup and ball game, activists switched their demand away from a ceasefire to an arms embargo for that reason. Because it's kind of like how Black Lives Matter got co-opted by Bank of America and sort of stopped meaning anything, and then people say, okay, well, defund the police, because that you can't really co-op, right? You can't have
right.
the WellsFargo.com defund the police seminar, right?
Right.
It doesn't really work. And cutting off arms to Israel is by the way was the implied mechanism with which one got a ceasefire.
Right.
But now they have to say it explicitly because they've done this rhetorical game, and I think assurances that. Again, not that necessarily Harris will cut off arms to Israel, or that's sort of too whatever, but at least a threat of it, as Reagan did, as Bush did, as Biden did in 2021. This is always the implied threat. This is the whole point of having client states. And so I think that something towards that, even if it is kind of couched in this as a kind of CIA effort, or whatever, right? It's not like this. Everyone in the security state is gung ho for this. There are allies that.
You had Lloyd Austin coming out in December saying, you can win the battle but lose the war with this type of thing.
They've been saying this stuff for months. Everybody knows it, right? And again, even Blinken behind closed doors says it. So it does appear to be a uniquely recalcitrant, racist, stubborn old Biden thing.
Well, that's the thing is, I think, this is where it gets difficult to define where Harris is, because from my perspective, Biden seems to be uniquely like sui generis in terms of his just utter disregard for Palestinian lives. This is a guy who supposedly, made Menachem Begin blush in the assault on Lebanon 40 some odd years ago. And so I think like just by virtue of that, there is a certain benefit of doubt that is given to Harris. But I do think that benefit of doubt, it's not sustainable over the course of 12 weeks. Certainly, it's very problematic if she picks someone like Shapiro, it seems to me, where he is sort of very clearly associated with a similar perspective as Biden's in terms of like, his Zionism and his disdain for people who are protesting against this. But I guess we will, if she is to make those overtures to these groups, if that's the way that she would signal it, then we will have a better sense in the coming weeks. But we will link to your piece that's at Real News today. And I think it's going to be interesting to see if there is this benefit of doubt that is given to her, or if broadly the people who are definitely, I think, sort of turned off by Biden over this issue are going to sort of require some form of like receipts or something to that effect.
I mean, unfortunately, you know, branding matters. The more sophisticated empathy speak is, I think, it works. Again, I think the White House's effort to co-opt the concept of ceasefire and completely alter the meaning was incredibly successful. It got a lot of the heat off, you know, in conjunction with colleges going on summer break and police crackdowns. But the heat really got off of them after that, because then they could sort of shift the burden and say, oh, well, we support a ceasefire negotiation. And of course, it was a totally different thing than what everyone was demanding. Right. So I mean, these people are pretty sophisticated. They knew that Biden was going to go all in on this to the end, and they knew that this was a PR problem to manage. And by and large, they've actually, I think, done a pretty decent job of it since February.
Do you think Biden thought that it would go this long, though? I mean, my sense is that you think he did? Yeah.
I think he's a racist who thinks in sort of generic war on terror dynamics, and he thinks that they're basically equivalent to Nazis, and it's World War II, and if it lasts 5 years, it lasts 5 years. I don't see any reason to believe.
Do you think Harris has that same disposition?
I have no idea what Harris thinks. Harris has no pedigree of political or ideological commitments whatsoever to speak of. I mean, she shifts positions every few months. She was supporting single payer, then not supporting single payer. I don't even think Harris knows what Harris believes. And possibly that could work to one's advantage, right?
If hopefully, if
she sees this as that's why it has to be
far
seen
be
as
it for me to have the CIA being influencing.
I mean, it's just the way it's the way the cookie crumbles, because this has gotten so egregious and so bad for the brand, and I think that, but again, none of this is possible without U.S. support, and it's important to make that clear. And I think that the extent to which there needs to be a pain point. There needs to be a feeling that she can't take this good energy for granted, and that she can't take these good vibes and social media vibes for granted, and that there is a genuine threat of people sitting on the couch, because that's the issue of Gaza is not a vote for Trump. It's a people staying home thing, and without a real sense of that threat, and this is where you get into some of the kind of game theory. Without a sense of a real threat, she has zero incentive to adjust her position, even if she is in office. And if everyone becomes a mindless lever puller, again, as genuinely fearful and as genuinely threatening as another Trump term would be, then there's no incentive, because there's no other mechanism to influence this at all, because there was no primary, right? There was no way anyone could have chimed in on any of this, other than protesting into the void and being tear gassed and clubbed by cops and right wing vigilantes.
I mean, I think I am not 100% sure that there's no incentive in that instance once she becomes in office. Like, I don't know what Obama's incentive was, and he was much better, it seems to me, broadly speaking, on these
Well, I mean,
issues.
they killed 1,500 people in 2014. They killed 550 children, and that was in response to nothing. I mean, this was in response to over 1,100 Israelis and foreign nationals dying. That was in relation to nothing. So, again, there was always a sense of proportionality.
It was also a different era where you didn't have the record of Tim Kaine, boycotting Netanyahu's speech a couple of years later. I mean, it's a different environment as well. And,
it is. Again, I think people are tired of I think they've gotten, I think incredibly greedy with this.
There's no rationality to the policy that we have now towards Israel, it seems to me. And the rationale is one, I think, of that's why I think it's sort of uniquely Biden-esque, because the politics have definitely changed. You didn't have 86 Democratic senators and congresspeople boycott Netanyahu last time.
Yeah, but it's important to understand that those boycotts take place within a very specific liberal Zionist milieu, and they are about the personality of Netanyahu versus the actual military objectives. I think it gets a little confusing. And I think some of them were, but I think a lot of them, if you actually read their statements, were like, I support Israel's right to defend itself, blah, blah, blah. But Netanyahu's gone too far, even though the quote unquote war is actually quite popular in Israel and remains popular in Israel. And the idea that Hamas cannot survive post-ceasefire is actually the uniform consensus within the U.S. military establishment, the logical, or rather electoral establishment, the logical implication of which is that this goes on for years. So like,
well, that's in
everybody wants to have
Israel,
their cake
but
and eat it too.
I understand that. I understand that, and I know that it's definitely easier for U.S. politicians to make this about Netanyahu. But I think like their I think the hope there is that getting rid of Netanyahu or expressing it that way it's not going to impact the question of a one or a two state solution, and it's not going to address the question of Zionism more broadly, without a doubt. But I think like first order thing is to stop the immiseration and the sort of like rolling genocide, ethnic cleansing.
The problem is that even the so-called liberals or moderates in Israel still support this. That's the problem.
Well, I'm not talking about Israel. I'm talking about in the United States. I mean,
Right.
that's where
Look,
that's the leverage point.
Do I
here.
think there's been a vibe shift? Yes, and I think a lot of that has to do with the naked cruelty and cynicism of this current campaign. Like totally, I definitely think there's a vibe shift, especially around this kind of romantic 1960s,
Exodus. Yes. I know. Yes.
All that stuff is kind of just gone now, and then you see again, they're not doing themselves any favor by allowing their IDF soldiers on Telegram and TikTok.
And we just saw like them admitting after 7 months of reporting that there's been torture of Palestinian prisoners who have no business being there anyways. So, all right. Well, we'll link to your piece, and I guess over the course of the next, I don't know, 6 weeks, 12 weeks, we'll have a better sense of like whether Harris will come to the call. I think if Shapiro, frankly, gets the pick, I think a lot of that conversation has already been resolved.
Probably.
But we'll see. Adam Johnson, the podcast is Citations Needed, and the newsletter is The Column at Substack. We'll link to both those as well. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me on.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.